A woman left work, got in her car, and stopped answering messages. When police got involved, they could hardly find any evidence at all. But the case quickly started snowballing with new details. And once detectives finally uncovered the full story, they could barely process what they were looking at. It was hard to believe any of this had actually happened in real life. But it did. And the case quickly captured nationwide attention. Kendra Hatcher was born on February 3, 1980, in Springfield, Illinois. She grew up in a large, deeply religious family, and from the time she was little, church was a big part of her life. In school, Kendra didn't just get top grades. She also captained 2 teams, volleyball and cheerleading. On top of that, she spent a lot of her free time helping others. She led Bible classes for kids at her church and went on mission trips instead of spending summer breaks with her friends. After finishing high school near the top of her class, Kendra went on to a university in Indiana, where she studied biochemistry and Spanish. From there, she moved to Kentucky, graduated from dental school, and became a pediatric dentist. Kendra was determined to help children, no matter how much money their parents had, so she regularly treated kids in low-income neighborhoods, completely free of charge. She also traveled to Ecuador to treat kids who had no access to dental care at all. In 2015, Kendra got a job offer as a pediatric dentist at a clinic in Dallas, so she moved to Texas and rented an apartment in an upscale complex. She was 35 at the time and had already built a successful career, but she also wanted a family. A few months later, she met a 38-year-old man online named Ricardo, and things between them took off quickly. Ricky was a Harvard-trained doctor, working as a dermatologist with a solid career of his own. After just a few dates, Kendra and Ricky felt like they were made for each other. On top of both being in medicine, they shared the same values, the same interests, and the same big plans for the future. Kendra was always full of energy, and Ricky matched her pace. They spent the summer of 2015 practically inseparable, traveling together whenever they could. By August, they were already talking about marriage, and had even set up a joint wedding fund to save for the ceremony of their dreams. Ricky was also planning to move to California that fall, and Kendra was going to go with him. Over the next few weeks, they were busy getting ready for the move. At the same time, they planned a trip to visit Kendra's parents and also booked a short vacation in Mexico. Their flights were set for September 3rd. The day before their trip, Ricky finished his shift a little after 4 p.m., grabbed his suitcase from home, and headed over to Kendra's apartment. She was still at work, and he planned to just wait for her there. Around 6 o'clock, he went out for an evening run and got back about an hour and a half later. He hadn't taken his phone with him, and when he returned, he saw that Kendra had sent 2 texts. At about 6:45, she'd written that her shift was finally over and she was on her way home. 20 minutes later, she sent another message saying she'd decided to swing by a friend's place to borrow an underwater camera for their trip. Then, 5 minutes after Ricky got back from his run, she texted again that she was done with everything and was heading straight home. A little later, he texted her that he was starving and asked what she wanted for dinner, but she didn't reply. Figuring she just couldn't answer while driving, he wrote that he'd walk over to a nearby Mexican food truck and grab something for both of them. On his way back, Ricky noticed that the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's complex was crawling with police. Patrol cars were everywhere with their lights on, and the entrances and exits were taped off in yellow. He texted Kendra about it and told her to find somewhere else to park her car. But again, there was no response. He went back up to her apartment and waited a while longer. But Kendra still didn't come home. At that time, Ricky didn't panic at all. He assumed she might have remembered some last-minute errands before their trip and was just tied up. Eventually, he decided to drive back to his own place to grab a few more things for the road. When he returned to Kendra's building, he got into the elevator and pressed her floor, but a police officer standing inside immediately stopped him and said he couldn't go up. That's when it suddenly hit Ricky that Kendra's long silence might be connected to the police presence at her complex. And a short time later, officers confirmed his worst fear. Kendra had been found dead in the parking lot. According to officers, someone walked up to her just after she stepped out of her car and shot her in the back of the head at almost point-blank range. The killer took her purse and the underwater camera she just borrowed from her friend. At first, everything pointed to a robbery. Kendra lived in an upscale complex, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping into the multi-level garage hoping to mug a resident. Maybe they hadn't planned to kill her, but she screamed or tried to run. The attacker panicked and pulled the trigger. But that theory started to fall apart almost immediately. You could only get into the garage with a passcode that only residents had. And the killer didn't even take her phone, even though it was sitting in plain sight. To detectives, it began to look much more like something personal, and Ricky was the first person they took a hard look at. The fact that he'd been in her apartment and went in and out around the time of the murder made them wonder if he was involved. But surveillance footage and witness statements eventually showed he hadn't been in the garage when the shooting happened. He also seemed genuinely shocked and devastated, enough that investigators began to doubt he had anything to do with it. Soon, officers found a witness who'd been in the garage at the time of the shooting. One of the residents had gone down there in the elevator with a friend, and as soon as the doors opened, they heard a gunshot nearby, followed by a piercing scream. The two men panicked, ran to their car, and locked themselves inside. Moments later, an old black Jeep drove past them. They immediately assumed the driver had something to do with the gunshot, because the Jeep was flying through the narrow garage at high speed, heading down as if the driver didn't realize it dead-ended below. A few seconds later, the Jeep came back up and turned the other way toward the exit. The resident called 911 and drove outside. As he passed Kendra's car, he saw a woman's body lying next to it in a pool of blood. Security cameras didn't cover the exact spot where the shooting happened, but detectives quickly found the black Jeep on other cameras. And that's where the first surprise came in. The driver was clearly a woman. That detail made the robbery theory look even weaker. Investigators tried to track the Jeep through its plates and registration, but got nowhere. The only thing they could say for sure was that the vehicle didn't belong to anyone who lived in the building. Detectives started talking to Kendra's friends and family, trying to figure out if she'd had any conflicts with anyone. She'd only been living in Dallas for about 6 months, so her circle there wasn't very big yet, but she had already made a few close friends. All of them said the same thing. Kendra didn't have enemies, and there hadn't been any drama in her life. At work, it was no different. Her colleagues said every parent was happy with her, and that Kendra was amazing with kids. With no real suspect to focus on, police decided to release images of the black Jeep to the media and asked the public to help identify the driver. The next day, toward evening, detectives got a call from a man named Joe. He told them the vehicle in the footage was definitely his, but he hadn't been the one driving it. According to Joe, on the day of the murder, his childhood friend, a woman named Brenda, had reached out to him. He owned an auto shop, and she asked if he could take a look at her friend's car, a woman named Crystal. Brenda and Crystal came by the shop, dropped off the car, and asked Joe if he could lend them something to drive while he worked on it. Joe handed them the keys to his black Jeep, and the two women drove off. That same evening, Joe went to a cafe where he and Brenda had agreed to meet so she could return the Jeep. But when she showed up, Crystal wasn't with her, and neither was the car. Brenda said her friend had gone off to run some errands but would be there soon. They sat in the cafe for quite a while, and the whole time, Brenda kept trying to call Crystal, but she never picked up. Brenda said maybe her phone was acting up and asked to use Joe's. As soon as she dialed Crystal's number from his phone, Crystal answered right away and said she'd bring the Jeep over to Joe's house. A little later, they met there just like she'd promised. Crystal showed up with her young son, handed the car back, and she and Brenda drove off. Everything seemed normal. The next day, after Joe had already stopped thinking about the whole thing, he saw a news report about Kendra's murder and froze when he realized the police were looking for his Jeep. From the CCTV footage, it was obvious. That wasn't just the same model, it was his car. Joe met up with Brenda and told her he'd seen his Jeep on the news in connection with the killing, demanding an explanation. At first, she tried to convince him it was some other vehicle, but Joe was absolutely sure it was his. That's when she said Crystal had been the one driving and claimed she had no idea where her friend had gone, or whether she had anything to do with what happened. Brenda added that Crystal regularly used drugs and that day had probably taken his Jeep to pick some up. She also told him not to contact Crystal or the police, warning it would only cause serious trouble for him. On top of that, she advised him to hide the Jeep, or better yet, repaint it. Joe knew his car had been involved in a murder and was in shock over the whole situation. So at first, he didn't go to the police. He was scared he might end up in legal trouble himself, but the next day, he made up his mind and called 911. As soon as detectives got that information, they called Ricky and asked if he knew of any connection between Kendra, Brenda, and Crystal. To their surprise, Ricky said Kendra didn't know either of them, but he knew Brenda very well. She was his ex. And at that exact moment, while he was on the phone with detectives, Brenda was actually on her way over to his place. He and Brenda had met 3 years earlier, in 2012. She was 31 at the time, working as a dental assistant and studying to become a dentist herself. After a while, they moved in together and started talking about getting married. But, over time, Ricky felt less and less happy in the relationship. And by August 2014, 2 years after they met, he decided to break up with her. For Brenda, it was a heavy blow. She didn't want to let him go, and even took a break from school because she couldn't think about anything except their relationship. Still, she moved out and got an apartment in a nearby neighborhood. She also kept in close contact with Ricky, and he continued to help her out, since her salary barely covered rent. Sometimes he paid for her groceries and bills, and he even added her phone line to his own plan. Ricky had no intention of getting back together with her, though, and was actively trying to meet someone new. He just couldn't seem to find the right person. About 2 months after the breakup, Ricky decided to sign up for a dance class, and to his surprise, Brenda was there too. They got paired up, started talking again, and eventually, Ricky decided to give the relationship a second chance. But 6 months later, he ended up right back where he'd been before. He felt that they just weren't a good match. And this time, the breakup was final. Just like the first time, Brenda took it hard. But Ricky had no intention of getting back together and tried to keep contact to a minimum. That turned out to be easier said than done. He kept running into her all over the city. At first, he brushed it off. She lived not too far from him, so it didn't seem that strange. But after a while, it started to feel off. Wherever he went, Brenda somehow seemed to be there too. Later, Ricky met Kendra, and Brenda faded into the background for him. She was still on his phone plan, though, and he'd text her every so often, asking her to switch to her own plan because he was still paying for it. Each time, Brenda talked him into waiting a little longer. Eventually, he decided to cut it off himself and messaged her that he was going to shut her line down in early September, right around the time he and Kendra were planning their trip to Mexico. Now that police had told Ricky Brenda might have been involved in the murder, he was in a panic. After Kendra's death, he told all his friends and people close to him what had happened, including Brenda. She replied only the next day, offered her condolences, and asked how she could help. She even promised to bring him groceries, and at the exact moment detectives called him, Ricky was at home waiting for her to show up. Officers quickly tracked Brenda down at a library where she was studying for an exam, and brought her to the station for questioning. At the same time, detectives also located Crystal and questioned her separately. Brenda answered everything extremely carefully, as if she were afraid to give even a little more information than necessary. She said she spent several hours at the library the day before, studying for dental school exams, and then went to a cafe for about an hour. She even pulled out the receipt to prove it. Detectives realized she'd been at the cafe right during the window when Kendra was killed, which meant Brenda had a rock-solid alibi. Still, they weren't buying her story completely for a few reasons. Brenda couldn't remember the full timeline of her day, what time she'd woken up, how she'd gotten to the library or back home, or what she'd done with the rest of her time. But the cafe receipt, the one that covered the exact time of the murder, she produced instantly. It was sitting right on top inside her wallet, in almost perfect condition. Detectives got the feeling she'd been keeping it ready, knowing she might have to show it to the police. And that wasn't all. When they checked her alibi, it held up. She really had been at the cafe. And physically, she couldn't have been the one to shoot Kendra. But, now that both Brenda and Crystal were at the station, detectives took another look at the security footage and realized something important. The woman behind the wheel of the Jeep looked a lot more like Crystal than Brenda. While one group of detectives was talking to Brenda, their colleagues were questioning Crystal. And that interview went a lot further. At first, Crystal insisted she didn't know anything and had nothing to do with what happened. But once they showed her the surveillance footage, she changed her story and admitted she was the one driving the Jeep. Only, she said, things hadn't happened the way the police thought. According to her, she was just driving around town with her young son when a man with a gun suddenly jumped into the car and told her to do exactly what he said. He supposedly ordered her to pull into the parking garage of an apartment building, got out of the car, and disappeared from view. A few seconds later, Crystal said she heard a gunshot. Then the man came back, got in, and told her to drive away. Detectives knew this didn't line up with reality at all. First, the surveillance footage clearly showed there was no child in the car. Second, they asked the obvious question: if this man got out and disappeared, why did you just sit there and wait instead of driving off? After that, Crystal changed her story again. This time, she said there had actually been a man with her named Lamar, and that Brenda had paid him $500 to rob Kendra and steal her documents so she wouldn't be able to fly to Mexico with Ricky. But, for some reason, he decided to kill her instead. Right after that, Crystal was arrested, but Brenda's situation was more complicated. Detectives spent hours trying to get her to crack or admit to anything at all, and she kept calmly insisting she was innocent. In the end, they had to let her go. There wasn't a single piece of hard evidence tying her to the crime, and they couldn't just hold her indefinitely. As for Lamar, Crystal claimed she'd never met him before that night and had no idea how to find him. Detectives went through her phone and didn't see anyone under that name, but one contact did stand out: Christopher Love. In the days leading up to the murder, Crystal had called him several times, including shortly before and immediately after Kendra was killed. Police got his address, secured a search warrant, and found a handgun in his home that matched the caliber used in the shooting. On his phone, they also found a photo taken the day after the murder, showing him holding $500 in cash. When ballistics came back, experts confirmed it was the gun that killed Kendra. Christopher was arrested on the spot and, at first, denied having anything to do with it. When detectives laid out the evidence, he admitted he'd been in the parking garage but claimed Crystal was the one who pulled the trigger. They kept pressing, asking why. If that were true, the murder weapon was in his house and not hers. After a total of about 20 hours of questioning, he finally told them what really happened. The plan from the beginning had been to kill Kendra. Brenda was behind it, Crystal was the driver, and he was the one who fired the shot. With two people now pointing the finger at Brenda, detectives finally had enough to arrest her. But they were in for a nasty surprise. They found out she'd fled to Mexico, and no one seemed to know exactly where she was hiding. The FBI put her on their list of most wanted women, and Mexican authorities joined the hunt. Even so, Brenda managed to stay off the radar for months. It wasn't until about half a year later that police finally found her lying low at a relative's house. She barely went outside and spoke only to family, which is why it took so long to track her down. Catching her, however, created a new problem for the U.S. prosecutor. He fully intended to seek the death penalty, but Mexico would only agree to extradite her if the United States promised not to pursue a death sentence. That left him with two options: walk away and let Brenda live her life in Mexico, or give up the death penalty and go for life in prison instead. It wasn't a hard choice. He agreed to drop the death penalty, and Brenda was extradited back to the United States. By the time Brenda was back in the U.S., a lot had changed. Detectives had spent months building the case, and the pile of evidence they'd put together painted a genuinely disturbing picture. Crystal, who'd been sitting in jail this whole time, agreed to a plea deal: 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. In exchange, she started talking. She said she was broke and desperate, so when Brenda offered her $500 to help with the plan, she agreed. As for Christopher, Brenda told him she had powerful connections to a major cartel, and that if he helped her get rid of Kendra, there would be big money and a huge supply of drugs waiting for him. According to Crystal, Brenda was completely obsessed with Ricky. After he broke up with her, she couldn't think about anything else and spent almost all her time tracking him. She'd gotten access to his iCloud, which meant she could basically see everything he did on his phone. On top of that, she got into his computer and even added his phone to a Find My iPhone app so she could see his location at any time. That's why Ricky kept bumping into her all over town. Brenda knew exactly where he was almost every minute of the day. She also read all of his messages, including the ones with Kendra, and she could see their relationship moving fast. Watching Ricky fall in love with someone else was something she just couldn't accept. About 6 months before the murder, Brenda started putting together a plan to get rid of Ricky's new girlfriend and walk away without police ever looking in her direction. At one point, she tried to talk one of her friends into helping. The idea was to inject Kendra with a concentrated dose of some kind of drug and hit Ricky in the head hard enough to put him in a coma. Brenda was furious that he'd chosen someone else, but she still didn't want him dead, just out of the picture. That friend later told police she'd actually considered it for a while because Brenda offered her $2,000 in drugs, but in the end, she backed out. Later, through that same woman, Brenda met her friend Crystal and quickly earned her trust. Over the next few months, Brenda talked about almost nothing but Ricky and his new girlfriend. She saved every photo of them from social media, studied the routes of their trips, and read all of their messages. From there, the conversations turned darker. The two women started discussing how they could get rid of Kendra, and Brenda kept throwing out ideas, from poisoning her to staging some kind of tragic accident. Then, they decided they needed a third person, someone who would actually pull the trigger. So they went walking around Crystal's neighborhood, which was known for being pretty rough, and that's where they ran into a local drug dealer named Christopher. He quickly agreed to take the job in exchange for cash and drugs, and even said he already had a gun. After that, they spent a long time following Kendra, learning her routes inside and out. Eventually, Brenda decided the best place to kill her would be the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's building. They started sneaking in by tailing residents' cars as they drove through the gate, using their entry code. They memorized where Kendra usually parked, and even talked about putting a tracker on her car in case she picked a different spot. Finally, they chose a day and set the plan in motion. Brenda went to one friend and asked to borrow his car, saying hers had broken down. He agreed, and Crystal and Christopher set out to do the job. But they quickly realized the car had some kind of mechanical issue and got spooked that it might ruin everything. Brenda returned that car to her friend and then turned to someone else, Joe, the same Joe who later came forward to the police. He lent her his black Jeep. Crystal got behind the wheel. Christopher hid in the back seat, and Brenda got out near the library so she'd have an alibi. Crystal and Christopher drove over to the clinic where Kendra worked and waited for her to head home. But she was running late, which wasn't part of the plan. Eventually, Crystal left the area, dropped Christopher off near her neighborhood, picked up her son from school, took him to her parents' place, then came back for Christopher, and together, they returned to Kendra's clinic. Before that, they'd put fake plates on the Jeep so it couldn't be traced. When Kendra finally pulled out of the parking lot, they followed her, but quickly lost her car in traffic. So, they headed straight to her building instead, waited for a resident to drive into the garage, and slipped in right behind them. Once inside, they found a spot to hide and lay in wait for Kendra. While they were waiting, Christopher wiped down the gun and every single round, then put on gloves. As soon as Kendra drove into the garage, parked in her usual spot, and stepped out of her car, Christopher ran up to her and fired a single shot at almost point-blank range. After that, he jumped back into the Jeep and Crystal tried to get out of the garage. At first, she accidentally drove down, thinking there was an exit there, only to hit a dead end. She turned around, made it out, and headed to a nearby town, where they wanted to get rid of Kendra's purse. Christopher had taken it so the whole thing would look like a robbery, another one of Brenda's ideas. When they got back to Dallas, they waited for Brenda's call. At that moment, she was sitting in a cafe with Joe, pretending she was trying to reach Crystal. But in reality, she was just stalling for time. Eventually, she dialed Crystal's number from Joe's phone, and her friend confirmed the job was done. After that, they returned the Jeep to its owner, then drove to Crystal's parents' house and burned Kendra's things in the backyard. It turned out they'd gone to that other town for nothing, failing to find a good place to dump the evidence. Afterward, Brenda paid them and said that if the police ever got close, she planned to run to Mexico. And while she was still off the detective's radar, she didn't miss the chance to comfort Ricky. She brought him groceries and acted like she was just a caring friend, looking after him in the middle of his grief. In the end, prosecutors had more than enough evidence on all three people involved, and the case moved to trial. First up was Christopher. In 2018, for his role in the murder, he was sentenced to death. Next came Crystal. She received the agreed-upon sentence from her plea deal, 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. And finally, in the summer of 2019, it was Brenda's turn, the woman who had put the whole plan together. Prosecutors told the jury she was driven by jealousy and an obsession on a truly terrifying scale, and that if it weren't for the conditions of her extradition from Mexico, she almost certainly would have been given the death penalty. The jury needed just 20 minutes to reach a verdict, an incredibly short time in a case like this. Brenda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, she showed no sign of remorse and never apologized to Kendra's family, though they didn't expect her to. Right now, all three are still behind bars. In February 2025, there was talk that a judge might finally set an execution date for Christopher, but so far, that hasn't happened. So, this complicated case eventually came to a close, but it left a permanent mark on everyone involved, because of how senselessly cruel it was. Even if you set aside the fact that Brenda was willing to have another woman killed simply because she'd fallen in love with her ex, there are still Christopher and Crystal, people who agreed to help carry out that plan for a few $100s, with zero regard for someone else's life. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. On Halloween night, a woman stayed home with her daughter for just a few minutes while her husband went to the store. When he returned, he was met with a horrible sight, something you wouldn't even see in horror movies. Later, even some police officers had to seek psychological help, as they had never dealt with anything quite like it, and the truth in this dreadful case shocked everyone who was involved. Doreen Erbert was born on November 29, 1952, in California and grew up in a very large family of 5 children. Doreen was a kind, positive person who always sought to help others. Since her school years, she decided to pursue a career that would allow her to help people. So, after college, she moved to San Francisco and started working as a physiotherapist. Doreen also dreamed of creating her own big family, and soon the opportunity presented itself. At the age of 24, she met a man named Michael Dennis. He worked at a manufacturing plant near Doreen's clinic, and soon, the couple began dating. A few months later, they decided to get married, and in 1976, their son, Paul, was born. Initially, Michael and Doreen were happy together, but after the birth of their child, their relationship started to deteriorate. Within a year, they decided to divorce. Their son stayed with his mother, and Michael could regularly visit him. Despite all this, they maintained a normal relationship. A year later, Doreen met a man named Charles. They began dating, got married, and decided to move to San Jose, settling in a quiet residential area. In 1979, their daughter, Diana, was born. Charles, like his wife, dreamed of having a big family. He raised her son and was overjoyed at the arrival of their daughter. However, tragedy struck the family in February 1980. 4-year-old Paul climbed over the fence around their pool and fell into the water. Doreen, who was at home at the time, noticed it too late. She pulled her son out of the water and called for an ambulance. They took the child to the hospital, and he was connected to a life support machine. But after 10 days, the doctors concluded that there was no chance of survival. The decision was made to disconnect him from the machine. Doreen was devastated and broken. She couldn't stop blaming herself, even though the police investigation showed it wasn't her fault. Nevertheless, the woman continued to live, and her little daughter helped her cope with this tragedy. 4 years after the tragic events, something good finally happened with the family. Doreen and Charles had been trying to have another child for a long time, but unfortunately, pregnancy had been interrupted twice. Eventually, Doreen became pregnant again. And this time, everything was going well. The couple was expecting the arrival of a boy, scheduled to be born in early November. Just a few days before Doreen was supposed to go to the hospital, the family decided to participate in Halloween activities. It was the evening of October 31st. All neighbors decorated their homes, handed out candies, and went trick-or-treating with their children in the neighborhood. Diana, who was 4 at the time, really wanted to join in, and her parents couldn't refuse. Despite Doreen being 9 months pregnant, she went trick-or-treating with her daughter, while Charles stayed home, handing out candies to other kids. The mother and daughter returned home shortly before 9 p.m. Charles informed his wife that they were running out of candies, and he planned to drive to the nearest store to refill their supplies, because he didn't want to leave the neighborhood kids without treats. He left the house around 8:50 p.m. and returned approximately 15 minutes later. Approaching the house, he noticed the front door was slightly ajar, which struck him as odd. However, what awaited him inside was a genuine nightmare. Upon entering, he discovered his wife lying in the corridor on the floor, surrounded by a substantial amount of blood. Doreen showed no signs of life, and Charles immediately called 911. Soon, he noticed that in the living room lay the body of their unborn child. The man was in a deep state of shock, unable to believe what he was witnessing. At some point, the thought crossed his mind that Doreen might have had a miscarriage, but he quickly realized it was much worse. Next to the child lay a human hand. Charles immediately understood it belonged to Doreen, realizing that someone had attacked his family. He began searching for his daughter, fearing that something might have happened to her as well. There was so much blood on the floor that the man even slipped and fell while running through the house. Fortunately, the girl was alive. She was hiding behind the sofa in the living room. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics found a weak pulse in Doreen and rushed her to the hospital. Unfortunately, they couldn't save her, and she passed away in the ambulance. Her child also did not survive. Besides being removed from the woman's womb, the unknown assailant inflicted numerous blows on the baby. Medical experts examined Doreen's body and concluded that she had been struck numerous times with a long, sharp object resembling a sword or machete. Meanwhile, the police investigated the house, which resembled a scene from a horrific horror movie. Later, several officers sought psychological help, as even they couldn't cope with what they had witnessed. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, walls, and even the ceiling. Investigators examined the entire house but didn't find the perpetrator or any clues. Outside the house, police saw bloody footprints on the sidewalk. They stopped in the middle of the road, leading investigators to believe the killer had gotten into a car at that spot. Soon, officers discovered another clue. On the lawn in front of the house, there was a wolf mask covered in blood. They speculated that it might belong to the killer, as Charles stated they never owned such a mask. The evidence was sent to the laboratory, and police tried to talk to Diana. The girl was in complete shock, but she was the sole witness to what happened and potentially could help identify the assailant. Diana told them that shortly after her father left for the store, someone knocked on their door. Doreen went to answer and saw a man in a wolf mask holding a long blade. Told her, "I'm going to kill you now." After that, the woman screamed at her daughter to run out of the house, and the girl hid behind the sofa. Diana couldn't recall what happened next, to the moment when her father found her. She also couldn't help the police identify the attacker as he was wearing a wolf mask. Initially, investigators considered the victim's husband as a suspect. They found it suspicious how his trip to the store coincided with the arrival of the killer, as Doreen was attacked just minutes after her husband left home. When Charles returned, he stepped on blood multiple times, even falling and getting covered in it. Police didn't rule out the possibility that he might have done this intentionally to have an excuse for the blood on his clothes. However, detectives quickly found several inconsistencies in this theory. Firstly, Charles's shoes clearly didn't match those that left bloody footprints on the street. Secondly, the killer likely got into a car parked on the road in front of the house, but there were no blood traces found in Charles's vehicle, nor a different pair of shoes. Police went to the store Charles visited and spoke to the staff member. He confirmed that Charles did buy candies from him that evening, indicating he didn't have time to commit the murder. Surveillance footage from the store also supported this alibi, so detectives temporarily stopped considering him the prime suspect and asked Charles if he had anyone in mind who might wish harm to his family. And the man immediately pointed to Doreen's ex-husband, Michael. According to Charles, initially, Michael maintained a normal relationship with his ex-wife, but everything changed after the death of their son, who drowned in the pool. Michael blamed Doreen, believing she deliberately killed the boy to cut all connections with him. He even filed a civil lawsuit against her, seeking to hold her responsible for the child's death, but lost the case. Even during the time when Michael and Doreen were still married, he occasionally behaved quite strangely. After the birth of their son, he often fell into depression, distancing himself from both his wife and child. Doreen believed all of this was somehow connected to his childhood traumas. Michael had hearing problems from an early age, requiring him to constantly wear a bulky hearing aid. In those days, it was a rather large device, and because of it, other children constantly teased Michael. All of this led to the man growing up introverted, practically having no friends, and avoiding interaction with women. Despite seemingly leaving these issues behind after meeting Doreen, Michael couldn't shake off his old problems completely. This became one of the main reasons for the couple's decision to divorce. When Doreen married Charles, Michael began harboring resentment and animosity towards her, especially disliking the fact that another man was raising his son. These feelings intensified after Paul's death, and he started genuinely hating his ex-wife. Michael also lost his job, where he had spent most of his adult life. This factor also had some negative effect on him. After hearing all of this, the detectives decided to go to the man's house and talk to him. Charles's account was clearly insufficient to make Michael the prime suspect, but since he lived only 2 miles from Doreen's house, they decided to pay him a visit right away. Officers arrived at his home around midnight and saw the pickup truck parked near the garage. They shined a flashlight inside and saw something resembling blood on the steering wheel and keys. Afterward, they knocked on the door, but nobody answered. The lights were on, and officers could hear water running inside the house, leading them to suspect that the man might be disposing of evidence or cleaning blood-stained clothes. So, they continued knocking. Michael eventually opened the door. He remained calm, even after being informed about his ex-wife's death. The man answered all their questions nonchalantly and allowed the officers inside without a warrant. According to him, he went to the store during the day, returned home, and hadn't left since. Michael even agreed to sign voluntary consent papers to allow a search of his house. As he reached for the pen to sign, investigators noticed a deep cut on his right hand. Michael claimed he accidentally cut himself earlier while carving a pumpkin for Halloween. However, the police doubted his words. The wound was visibly fresh, and blood was still oozing from it. Meanwhile, a few officers started searching his house. Michael went upstairs with one of them since they asked him to show his ID. When they entered his bedroom, Michael reached for the bed headboard, but the officer immediately told him to step aside. His actions seemed suspicious. Why would he keep his documents behind the bed? When the officer approached, he saw a holster hanging on the bed headboard with a loaded gun inside. He took the weapon and led Michael downstairs to the other officers. Meanwhile, his colleagues discovered blood droplets on the floor, leading them to a washing machine in the garage and a pile of clothes with bloodstains. This was sufficient for an arrest, and they took the man into custody. Afterward, detectives, along with forensic experts, scrutinized the house more thoroughly, seeking evidence that might link Michael to the murder. The analysis of the blood would take a few days, and meanwhile, the police found some new gruesome discoveries. At first, they uncovered an empty box for a machete with an 18-inch blade. Medical experts confirmed that this model perfectly matched the wounds on Doreen's body. Secondly, Michael had 2 makeshift coffins in his house, leading detectives to suspect they were intended for Doreen and her husband. Additionally, the police found body bags typically used by medical staff. Considering Michael had no association with these items, it raised significant concerns. Putting all these pieces together, the police went to the judge to request a warrant for the suspect's arrest for an extended period. Without it, they could only detain him for a limited time. However, the judge deemed the evidence too circumstantial. As a result, Michael had to be released, and the man walked free. Nevertheless, 3 days later, the detectives got the answer from the lab. Experts found 2 types of blood at the crime scene, belonging to different individuals. Blood type analysis revealed that the majority of it shared the same blood type as Doreen, with a small amount matching Michael's. Apparently, the man injured himself during the attack on his ex-wife. This time, the judge promptly issued an arrest warrant, and Michael was officially charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her unborn child. Soon, detectives found another piece of evidence linking him to the crime. Speaking with Michael's acquaintances, they learned he owned the exact same wolf mask found near Doreen's house. On the previous Halloween, he wore it to a party, and police even discovered a photo of Michael wearing the mask. To eliminate any doubts, they found in his home the exact clothing he wore in that photo. But the story of the mask didn't end there. To further strengthen the case, police interviewed all of Doreen's neighbors about that evening. It turned out that children going door to door for candy saw an adult man wearing a wolf mask standing across the street from the victim's house, staring at it. Notably, they spotted him around 7 p.m., 2 hours before the murder. Michael's trial began in July 1988, 4 years after the murder. Initially, he pleaded guilty, but later changed his plea. He didn't deny committing the murder, but claimed innocence due to mental health issues. A psychologist assigned to him concluded that he indeed had serious mental problems. Michael told him that he snapped because of Halloween. Witnessing other kids joyfully trick-or-treating reminded him of Paul's death, triggering his breakdown. According to Michael, he went to Doreen's house with a machete on that evening. When she opened the door, he said, "You killed my son," and added that he intended to murder her. She immediately recognized the man behind the mask, screamed for her daughter to run, and in the next second, Michael attacked her. He insisted that he was unaware of Doreen's pregnancy, a claim that seemed hard to believe. Standing at just 4 feet 11 inches tall, all her friends insisted it was impossible not to notice her pregnancy. Before the tragedy, they even joked that because of her belly, Doreen had become broader than taller. The prosecution argued that the man was fully aware of his actions and had planned the crime in advance. During the investigation, detectives discovered he had told friends about his desire to kill his ex-wife and her husband, then dispose of their bodies in the bay. Given that they found 2 coffins and body bags in his home, the prosecution suggested he intended to carry out this plan, but changed his mind for some reason. Perhaps he panicked or feared staying in the house too long, thinking he might get caught. Doreen's daughter, Diana, also testified at the trial. At that time, she was 9 years old, and still vividly remembered what happened. Charles didn't want his daughter to go through such a traumatic experience, but she was the only witness. The trial spanned a year, and in the end, the man was found guilty of murdering Doreen and her child. Michael was sentenced to death, but while he awaited execution, California imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. As a result, Michael remains behind bars to this day, and his sentence is unlikely to be carried out anytime soon. Many years later, Diana revealed that this murder haunted her throughout her life, never allowing her to forget that horror for a moment. Eventually, she decided to forgive Michael and try to leave it all in the past, fearing she might lose her sanity otherwise. Alright guys, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please share your thoughts on this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot to me. Thank you. Hi guys, my name is Brandon, and today we'll delve into the case of a college student who was found dead at a public pool. Police found several important clues, but the case turned out to be much more complicated than it initially seemed. During the investigation, detectives uncovered a series of horrifying twists and eventually managed to solve the mystery. Alexandra Kemp was born on October 11, 1982, in the city of Leawood, Kansas. With a population of just over 30,000 people, it was one of the wealthiest suburbs in the Kansas City metropolitan area. Alexandra, who preferred to go by Allie, lived there with her parents and 2 brothers. From a very young age, she was incredibly active, participating in 19 different sports teams and various other activities throughout her school years. She had a passion for soccer and also excelled academically. After graduating from high school in 2001, Allie enrolled at Kansas State University to study ecology. She always wanted a career that would allow her to help others. Allie even planned to travel to Russia on an exchange program to help orphan children. In 2002, when she had finished her freshman year at college, 19-year-old Allie returned home for the summer break. She wanted to find a part-time job and also spend some time with her loved ones before returning back. She was also thrilled to reunite with her longtime boyfriend, Phil. The couple had been together for 5 years, but they had chosen different universities after high school. Despite the distance, they continued their relationship, and summer breaks were their only opportunity to be together. Allie and Phil landed a job together at the local public pool, and Allie's younger brother also joined in. Their shifts lined up one after the other. Phil worked mornings, Allie during the day, and her brother in the evenings. On Thursday, June 18th, Allie showed up for her shift to relieve Phil. At first, she thought about asking him to stay with her a bit, but then changed her mind since they had plans to meet up for a date later in the evening. The day was pretty overcast, so there weren't many visitors at the pool. Allie sat at her desk reading a book, waiting for the workday to end. As evening approached, her younger brother arrived at the pool to start his shift. However, to his surprise, he couldn't find his sister anywhere. Her phone, keys, and other personal items were left unattended on the table, yet Allie herself was nowhere to be seen. After searching the area, he decided to call their parents. Their father, Roger Kemp, rushed over immediately, growing increasingly worried as the situation seemed odd. He knew that Allie wouldn't just leave her belongings, including her phone, and leave work early. Roger meticulously searched the entire area, checking every corner. Finally, he reached the pump room. It was very dark inside, and at first, he didn't notice anything suspicious. But, as he was about to leave, something caught his eye. There was a blue tarp spread out in the corner, and a foot was sticking out from underneath. His heart sank as he got closer, realizing it was his daughter lying beneath it. Allie was covered in blood and bruises, showing no signs of life. She was also missing her shorts and underwear. Roger immediately called an ambulance, but the doctors couldn't save her. She passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. Medical experts determined that Allie had suffered a severe head injury and the cause of death was strangulation. They also found numerous defense wounds, indicating that Allie had tried to fend off her attacker. Police launched an investigation and quickly found the first piece of evidence. There was an open first aid kit with a pill container on the floor of the pump room, near where the victim was discovered. It was sent to the lab, and experts found male DNA on the container and its lid. Biological samples were also found on Allie's clothing. After comparing all these samples, experts concluded that they belonged to the same man, but he was not in the FBI database. Police began looking for possible suspects, starting with Allie's boyfriend. Given the brutality of the attack, investigators considered that the assailant might have had personal motives. According to Phil, after his shift, he went to visit friends, and his alibi was corroborated by several people. He also provided his DNA sample, which didn't match the perpetrators. The same was true for Allie's father and brother. They both provided their samples right away. Roger was overwhelmed with grief and spent the entire night at the morgue, unable to leave Allie alone. The next day, as some city residents gathered to express their condolences, he gave a speech and promised to find his daughter's killer at any cost. News of the murder quickly spread among the locals, who had rarely encountered such crimes before. As a result, the police received numerous tips, and, almost instantly, they found their first lead. Several pool visitors reported seeing a strange man lurking around the pool area the day before the murder, peering at them from behind bushes and even filming them. Other witnesses mentioned seeing a similar-looking man driving a beige Ford pickup truck in the pool parking lot. None of them recognized the man, and it seemed unlikely he was a visitor. Phil added another intriguing detail. One day, Allie had told him that she sometimes felt uneasy working alone, as if someone was watching her. She didn't specify if she had seen anyone suspicious near the pool, but the accounts of other witnesses suggested it could have been the same man. Another lead came from Allie's friend, Laurel. On the day of the murder, around 3 p.m., Allie called her, saying she was bored. Laurel decided to drive to the pool to keep her company. Upon arrival, she honked several times, expecting Allie to come out and meet her. But instead, a man came out from the pump room and waved at Laurel. Thinking it was Allie's boss, she thought that her visit might cause trouble for her friend and decided to leave. Upon hearing this account, detectives believed that this man was likely the killer. Based on Laurel's testimony, they created a composite sketch of the suspect, which was then distributed to local newspapers and TV channels. Phil initiated a flyer distribution campaign featuring the composite sketch and a description of the suspect. With the help of his friends and numerous volunteers, thousands of flyers were spread throughout this town. Despite all these efforts, the police still couldn't close in on the perpetrator. Roger also raised $50,000 as a reward for any information leading to the murderer, but it yielded no results. Sometime later, he suddenly had an idea to put up a billboard featuring the suspect's composite sketch along the busy highway he regularly uses on his way to work. He discussed this idea with the police, who supported it. However, they mentioned that their department had no money to rent a billboard and he would have to cover all the expenses himself. Roger contacted a company that was renting billboards and asked about the cost. When they learned about his daughter's murder, they decided to provide the billboard completely free of charge, wanting to help crack the case. Allie's father, who hadn't expected such a turn of events, gratefully accepted their offer. Together with the police, they created a banner featuring the composite sketch, the suspect's car drawing, and information about the $50,000 reward. After the billboard went up, the police began receiving significantly more tips, with the number surpassing 1,000 in just a few weeks. They carefully checked each one, and soon stumbled upon some intriguing lead. They were told the composite sketch resembled a local resident named James Strader. Detectives went to talk to him, but Strader claimed he was at work during the time of the murder. His boss confirmed his alibi and he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. However, soon the police received another tip about Strader and found out he owned the same type of car as the suspect. But there was more to come. The police learned that he was wanted in 2 states, suspected of a series of crimes. In just 3 weeks, he allegedly committed 3 sexual assaults and 2 kidnappings. He assaulted his ex-girlfriend, then forced her to drive with him in search of a new victim. Soon he stopped and attempted to break into someone's home to steal money. At that moment, a 14-year-old girl was passing by, and Strader forced her into his car with threats. He then drove to a remote area, assaulted the girl and his ex-girlfriend, left them both there, and drove away. Sometime later, he knocked on another woman's door and said that his car had broken down. When she opened the door, Strader pulled out a knife, entered the house, and assaulted her. He then abducted the woman and drove her to another town, but she managed to escape. Eventually, he was apprehended in Utah. Strader pulled into a gas station and drove away without paying, prompting the staff to call the police. Soon after, a police officer noticed his car and pulled him over, ran his ID, and saw that the man was wanted for kidnappings and assaults. While speaking with the officer, Strader smirked at him and said he should handcuff him. Investigators in Allie's case immediately reached out to their colleagues in another state, asking for a DNA sample from Strader. However, as soon as the lab finished the analysis, the detectives faced an unexpected turn. His DNA didn't match the sample found on Allie's clothing or the pill bottle. Eventually, Strader received a life sentence for his other crimes, and detectives continued their search for Allie's killer. For many months, they made no progress, but in the fall of 2004, the detectives received another interesting tip. A person called the police, saying the composite sketch resembled his acquaintance, a man named Teddy Hoover. Upon investigating this man, police learned that he lived in Kansas City and worked for a pool maintenance company. They also found his name in the case files. Hoover was one of the people gathered at the pool when the body was discovered. He had been questioned along with others, but hadn't raised any suspicions. Investigators went to his house and asked some questions about Allie's murder. Hoover claimed he hardly remembered where he was on that particular day, as it had been 2 years. The officers asked for his DNA sample, but Teddy refused, saying he needed to discuss it with his lawyer first. Police didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect, but they lacked any evidence to tie him to this crime. Later, they decided to speak with him again, but there was a problem. Teddy, along with his girlfriend, had simply disappeared, and their current whereabouts remained unknown. A month later, another tip came into the police. Someone, who decided to remain anonymous, informed them that Teddy and his girlfriend were now living in Connecticut, over 1,000 miles away from Kansas City. This seemed highly suspicious. Teddy had moved across the country right after the police took an interest in him. The detectives reached out to the state's postal service to track Teddy's new address through them, but they couldn't find any information about him. So, detectives requested the same for his girlfriend's name, and this time they hit the mark. The woman was receiving mail at an address in the small town of Bantam. However, there was something peculiar. A man named Benjamin Appleby was also receiving mail at the same address. Investigators checked this name and discovered that this man had an extensive criminal record, including robberies and assaults. Interestingly, Teddy Hoover also had convictions for similar offenses, including an active arrest warrant for public indecency. Detectives began to suspect that something wasn't right. According to the postman, who regularly delivered letters to Teddy's girlfriend's address, he only saw 2 people in the house. And based on his descriptions, Appleby closely resembled Hoover. The police once again asked their colleagues in Connecticut for help. They went to the house and confirmed that Teddy Hoover indeed lived there, leading to his arrest on the warrant for public indecency. Meanwhile, detectives in Allie's case arrived in Connecticut and started preparing for the interrogation. They set up an investigation board with photos of the victim, Teddy, and pictures from the crime scene, hoping it would help to obtain a confession from Teddy. As he was brought into this room, he immediately became nervous seeing all this. Almost right away, he admitted that Benjamin Appleby was his real name, and Teddy Hoover was the identity of his late friend, which he used to avoid arrest. At first, he denied any involvement in Allie's murder, but that didn't last long. Just 10 minutes into the questioning, he started talking. According to Benjamin, on that day, he went to the pool to speak with the manager and offer his company's cleaning services. That's when he saw Allie, and he instantly liked her. She was in the pump room, and Benjamin approached her, trying to start a conversation. Allie responded politely to his compliments, but clearly wasn't interested. Benjamin continued to compliment her, but she wasn't into it and tried to leave. He blocked the door with his hand and tried to touch her. When Allie pushed him away, he started beating her. He hit her multiple times, took off her clothes, intending to assault her, but then he heard a honking outside. So, he strangled her, covered her with a tarp, and went outside where he saw her friend, Laurel, sitting in her car. He waved at her, and she drove away. After that, he left the crime scene too. Sometime later, Benjamin decided to come back and arrived just as medics were taking Allie out of the pump room. That's when the police questioned him, but he didn't raise any suspicions. Benjamin said he didn't know why he committed this crime and regretted it. He also added that he really liked Allie, and when she pushed him away, he just lost control over himself. After obtaining his confession, investigators sent his DNA sample to the lab. It matched the samples found on Allie's clothes and the pill container. When asked why he took those pills, Benjamin said he was trying to find something in the first aid kit to use as a lubricant. The day after his arrest, the man hired a lawyer who tried to withdraw his confession, even though just a few hours earlier, Benjamin had said he didn't want to put the victim's family through a trial. However, with his DNA found on the victim's clothes, there was hardly any chance of avoiding punishment. At the trial, his lawyer argued that the murder was accidental, but he couldn't prove such a far-fetched version of events. In 2005, Benjamin was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. This means he wouldn't be eligible for release until 2054, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Considering he was only 29 at the time of sentencing, he would likely remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Since then, Benjamin has repeatedly tried to appeal his sentence, but all his attempts have failed. However, each attempt has been a heavy burden for Allie's family. Her father has done everything he could to ensure his daughter's killer won't be released. Allie's parents also organized self-defense classes for women in her memory. The project gained widespread attention and tens of thousands of women have been trained through it. Allie's father was even invited to the White House to meet with Barack Obama. The president awarded him for organizing the self-defense classes and highlighted their importance. Roger was also thanked for coming up with the idea of posting information about wanted criminals on billboards. It turned out that no one had done this before, and this method proved to be very effective. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A young woman walked out of her house and vanished without a trace. A few days later, police got involved, and right away, they uncovered several disturbing clues and a list of potential suspects. Despite that, they weren't able to solve this mystery. This went on until they stumbled upon one unusual piece of evidence, something that completely changed the course of the investigation and finally revealed what really happened to her. Misty Morse was born on April 10, 1978, in Springfield, Ohio. At some point, her family moved to a city called Indian Harbor Beach in Florida. Not long after the move, her parents decided to get a divorce and Misty stayed with her mom but remained very close with her dad. She was a cheerful, outgoing girl who had lots of friends and loved the outdoors. More than anything, she enjoyed swimming in the ocean, surfing, and just hanging out at the beach with her friends. After high school, Misty worked a few different jobs before enrolling in a local community college. She wasn't sure what career she wanted to pursue, so she planned to figure it out along the way. By the summer of 2000, 22-year-old Misty was working as a waitress at a local cafe and spending most of her free time with friends. On the evening of July 20th, Misty told her mom she was heading out. They talked for a few minutes, but then, Misty's phone rang. She answered with just a few words, hung up, and told her mom she had to go. The next day, when her mother got home from work, Misty wasn't there. At first, she didn't think much of it. Misty sometimes worked late shifts, and on those days, they barely saw each other. Plus, she was an adult, so her mom thought that maybe she had just stayed over at a friend's place. But when another day passed and Misty still hadn't come home or reached out, her mom started to worry. It had been 2 days now and there was not a single word from her. What made it even stranger was that they shared a car, switching off every week. But this time, Misty never came to pick it up. Her mom tried calling her multiple times, but Misty never answered. This went on until July 24th, when her worry turned into full-blown panic, and she decided it was time to go to the police. But before she could, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw police officers standing there, and the moment she looked at their faces, she knew something was terribly wrong. They told her they'd found Misty's body. On July 23rd, the day before police arrived at Misty's mother's door, a retired judge in Merritt Island stepped outside to mow his lawn. His property sat right along the river, and as soon as he looked toward the water, he noticed something weird. At first, he thought it was the body of a large animal in the river. Then a strong, unmistakable smell of decay hit him. As he moved closer, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human body. The judge immediately notified the police. When officers arrived, they confirmed that it was a woman's body floating in the water. But they ran into a serious problem right away. The body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, making it extremely difficult to recover. To retrieve it without further damage, they had to use a special type of fabric, one that allowed water to drain through while keeping the remains securely contained. When detectives finally managed to retrieve the body, it became immediately clear they were dealing with a murder. The victim had no clothes on, and her wrists and ankles were bound with rope. Police also found large amounts of duct tape on her body. Her legs had been tied to plastic shopping bags, which investigators suspected had been filled with rocks or some other heavy objects meant to keep her submerged. But the bags apparently had torn open, and whatever was inside had spilled out. In addition to the rope and tape, detectives noticed something unusual. A few rubber cords, the kind specifically used to secure window protective screens, had also been tied around her body. All of these items were sent to the lab for analysis while medical examiners began their work. But right away, they faced a major obstacle. Determining the exact cause of death was nearly impossible. There were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, and the level of decomposition made it difficult to identify less obvious trauma. In the end, experts concluded that the most likely cause of death was either strangulation or drowning. The second theory suggested that she had been in the water for several days, and there was a strong possibility that she was still alive when she was thrown in. There were no obvious clues on the body, no DNA, fingerprints, or anything that could point to a suspect. So, investigators focused on identifying the victim. It wasn't easy, but the next day, they finally got a match. Fingerprints confirmed that the woman found in the river was Misty Morse. By that time, forensic experts had already examined the ropes, plastic bags, and duct tape used to restrain her, but unfortunately, none of those items yielded any useful evidence. There was, however, one thing that stood out. A few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape. It was pretty obvious that they didn't belong to Misty, and detectives knew these hairs could be a crucial lead, so they sent them to the lab for further analysis. Once investigators confirmed Misty's identity, they went to speak with her mother. She told them the last time she saw her daughter was on the evening of July 20th, 3 days before Misty's body was found. She also mentioned something that caught their attention. Right before leaving the house, Misty got a short phone call. It seemed like someone had arrived to pick her up and was calling to let her know they were outside. But Misty never said who she was meeting, which made it much harder to track down a potential suspect. Hoping to find answers, detectives requested her phone records. But there was a major problem. At the time, phone companies didn't have the capability to provide details about incoming calls, not even the caller's number. The only thing police could confirm was that Misty received 2 calls that night. The first one lasted a few minutes. Then, shortly after, there was a second, much shorter call, the one her mother heard right before Misty walked out the door. Detectives searched Misty's room and they found her purse with all of her belongings except for 2 things: her driver's license and her phone. The fact that she left her purse behind suggested that she likely hadn't planned to be gone for long, but somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. This led investigators to a troubling conclusion. Misty's killer was probably someone she knew well, someone she trusted enough to leave with that night. Forensic experts also had some interesting findings. While they hadn't recovered any clear evidence from the ropes or duct tape, they did notice something unusual. The type of rope used to bind Misty was commonly found on boats. Moreover, the knots were tied in a way that suggested the killer had some kind of military or maritime training. These were knots typically taught in the Navy and the Coast Guard. And then, there was the duct tape. It wasn't just any kind of tape. It was actually a special type, designed specifically for temporary repairs on boats. All of this pointed in a specific direction. Misty's killer not only had access to a boat, but likely had some kind of military background. With no other solid leads, detectives turned their focus to Misty's personal life, hoping to uncover any connections that might bring them closer to finding her killer. Misty's mother told detectives that in the weeks leading up to her death, she had been seeing a guy named Teddy. He was a relative of one of her coworkers, and while they had gone on a few dates, their relationship hadn't had time to develop into anything serious. But when police looked into Teddy's background, they found something alarming. He had a long criminal record. He was arrested for assaults, sexual offenses, theft, and some other crimes. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and Teddy confirmed that he and Misty had been casually seeing each other for a few weeks, but insisted he had no reason to hurt her. As the interrogation went on, detectives started to second-guess whether he was involved. Teddy genuinely seemed upset about Misty's death, and nothing in his behavior indicated that he was trying to hide something. Still, they weren't taking any chances and asked for a DNA sample. At that point, they didn't actually have any DNA from the killer, so this was more of a test to see if Teddy was willing to cooperate, and he agreed to provide his DNA sample right away. He also gave them permission to search his apartment without a warrant. Detectives looked everywhere but found nothing that tied him to the crime. On top of that, investigators learned that Teddy had never served in the military and didn't have access to a boat. In the end, They started doubting his involvement and turned their attention to other potential suspects. Misty's relatives told investigators about another guy she had gone on a date with, someone named Bobby. At first, he didn't seem like a likely suspect. But then, detectives learned something that caught their attention. After their date, Misty told friends that Bobby wasn't really her type and that she wasn't interested in seeing him again. But Bobby didn't seem to get the message. He kept calling, trying to convince her to meet up again. He was persistent. Too persistent, actually. In fact, Misty even told people that she felt like he was stalking her. Detectives decided to pay Bobby a visit, and as soon as they arrived at his house, they noticed something that made their suspicions grow. He had a boat on his property. Bobby agreed to answer their questions. He claimed that he wasn't too bothered that Misty stopped responding to him, but he did admit that he had been calling her every day, right up until July 23rd. That's when he found out she was dead. For the most part, Bobby acted like he was genuinely upset about Misty's death. But then, something completely unexpected happened. In the middle of the conversation, Bobby suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out Misty's driver's license, then handed it over to the detectives. He explained that he had been holding on to it since their first date. According to him, Misty didn't have any pockets that night, so she asked him to keep her ID for her, and then she simply forgot to take it back. Detectives found this story highly suspicious. Their date had been weeks ago. Was it really possible that Misty never noticed her ID was missing? And if she had left it with him, why wouldn't she have asked for it back? With growing doubts, investigators asked for permission to search Bobby's home. He agreed, but after a thorough search, they came up empty-handed. There was nothing linking him to the murder. And then, there was another issue. Bobby had never served in the military, which didn't match the profile of the killer. So, it seemed like Bobby was just another dead end. In the end, detectives left Bobby's house empty-handed, but just as they were about to leave, he surprised them yet again. He suddenly remembered something from his date with Misty, something that might actually be useful. According to Bobby, Misty had mentioned an ex-boyfriend who had a reputation for being quite aggressive. Bobby didn't know his name, but he did recall one key detail. The guy had served in the Marines. That immediately caught the detectives' attention, so they went straight to Misty's mother to ask if she knew who Bobby might have been talking about. She immediately had an answer. His name was Brent Huck. Her mother explained that Misty and Brent had been together for quite a while, but had broken up about a year before her death. She remembered that Misty had described Brent as controlling and aggressive. He always wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Eventually, his behavior became too much, and Misty ended the relationship. After that, her mother never heard anything about him again. Detectives started digging into Brent Huck, and what they found was quite interesting. He lived in the same area where Misty's body had been found. He had also served in the Marines, just like their profile suggested. And on top of that, he worked as a charter boat captain, meaning he had easy access to boats and the type of specialized equipment found on Misty's body. With all of this in mind, detectives decided to bring Brent in for questioning, but they didn't want to tip him off. Instead of confronting him directly, they told him they were just trying to gather as much information as possible about Misty's personal life, since they had no strong leads. Brent agreed to talk. He admitted that he and Misty continued seeing each other from time to time after their breakup, but insisted that their relationship was completely over. There was nothing romantic between them anymore. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. Brent didn't seem even remotely upset about Misty's death. If anything, he was the opposite. He came across as cocky, almost arrogant. It was a stark contrast to how other suspects reacted when talking about Misty's murder, and that alone was enough to make detectives suspicious. Despite Brent's arrogant demeanor, detectives managed to get some very interesting information out of him. When asked about the last time he spoke to Misty, Brent named the exact night she disappeared. Wednesday, July 20th. That was the same night Misty told her mom she was heading out to meet someone. Brent admitted that he called her twice that evening, but he insisted that they never saw each other that night. That immediately raised red flags for detectives. Based on what Misty's mother had told them, they were convinced that whoever made the last call was the person who picked her up. Misty's phone records showed that she hadn't received any other calls that evening. But Brent stuck to his story. He claimed that he had called Misty because he had heard some rumors that she was telling people she was pregnant with his child. At the time, he was dating someone else. And according to him, these rumors were threatening his relationship. So he called Misty to convince her to stop spreading lies. Detectives, however, weren't buying it. For one, medical examiners found no signs of pregnancy during Misty's autopsy. And on top of that, none of her friends had ever heard her say anything about being pregnant. So, Brent's entire story just didn't add up. Detectives asked Brent for permission to search his home. And, just like the previous suspects, he agreed. But this time, they found more than they expected. The first thing that caught their attention was in the kitchen. Brent had multiple plastic bags from the same store as the ones that had been tied to Misty's legs. At first, this didn't seem like much. After all, plenty of people shop at the same grocery store. But detectives decided to take a closer look. Forensic experts examined the manufacturing codes stamped onto each bag during production, and when they compared them with the ones found with Misty's body, they discovered something disturbing. They were all made at the same time, on the same production line, in the same factory. This meant that there was a strong chance that the bags used in the crime had come directly from Brent's kitchen. And that was just the beginning. In his garage, detectives found the exact same type of rubber cord that had been wrapped around Misty's body. Just like with the bags, they checked the serial number and confirmed that both the cord in Brent's garage and the one found on Misty's body had been produced on the same machine from the same batch. Then, they found a roll of special marine duct tape, the same kind that had been used to bind Misty. And finally, they discovered rope identical to what was found on Misty's body, tied with the exact same military-style knots. At this point, detectives didn't just have a suspicion, they had evidence. After wrapping up the search and analyzing all those items, detectives were almost certain that Brent was responsible for Misty's murder. They believed that he might have actually heard rumors about Misty being pregnant with his child and panicked. Maybe he feared this would ruin his current relationship and decided to eliminate the problem before it could escalate. What he didn't realize, however, was that Misty wasn't pregnant, and she likely had no idea that these rumors even existed. With all the evidence in hand, detectives took their case to the district attorney, hoping to move forward with formal charges. But then, things took a frustrating turn. After reviewing the case, the prosecutor refused to press charges. He explained that every single piece of evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct proof, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no confession, just a strong chain of coincidences. As convincing as it seemed, the prosecutor warned them that it wouldn't be enough for conviction in court. In the end, he told detectives they needed to find something stronger. So, despite having a prime suspect and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, investigators found themselves back at square one, knowing who likely did it but unable to prove his guilt. Detectives did have one more piece of evidence, though, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to crack the case. As we know, forensic experts had found a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape on Misty's body. When they analyzed them, they discovered that the hairs belonged to an animal, most likely a dog, and Brent just so happened to own a black dog, a mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler. Detectives strongly suspected that the hairs came from his dog, but there was a problem. In those years, no forensic lab in the country was capable of conducting a full DNA analysis on dog hair. Without that technology, they couldn't prove the hairs belonged to Brent's dog. And without the proof, the evidence was useless. So, with no other leads to follow, the case stalled. 4 months, detectives searched for anything that could break it open, but they kept hitting dead ends, and Misty's killer was still out there. For 2 years, the case remained at a standstill until detectives took another look at the evidence and stumbled upon something new. They learned that a recent murder case in California had been solved using DNA analysis of dog hair, and this was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. Without wasting any time, they reached out to the same lab that had conducted the analysis in California and asked them to examine their evidence. Forensic experts extracted a DNA profile from the animal hairs found on the duct tape. Then, detectives collected a sample from Brent's dog. When the results came back, there was a perfect match. The hairs belonged to the same dog. And there was an even deeper connection. This wasn't just any dog. Misty had actually given Brent the dog as a gift back when they were dating. Now, detectives had the evidence they needed to finally bring him to justice. They went back to the prosecutor, and this time, he agreed to take the case to trial. On October 23, 2002, Brent was finally arrested, and a few months later, his trial began. Brent never backed down, insisting that he had nothing to do with Misty's murder. He claimed that the real killer must have been one of her other ex-boyfriends, but, with a stack of evidence against him, the prosecution had no trouble convincing the jury of his guilt. In the end, Brent Huck was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the trial, prosecutors assumed that Brent had truly believed the pregnancy rumors and panicked, deciding to get rid of Misty before she could ruin his life. We may never know exactly how he convinced her to meet up that night or how things escalated once she did, but detectives had their own theory. They believed Brent lured Misty to his home, tied her up, and loaded her into his boat. Then he took her out on the water and threw her in, leaving her to drown. After his conviction, Brent tried to appeal, but the court denied his request. To this day, he remains behind bars, still insisting he's innocent. After the sentencing, Misty's father spoke to reporters. He said he hoped Brent would live 1,000 years in that prison cell, waking up every single day, remembering the pain he caused to their family. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A woman was found dead in her mansion, and at first, no one doubted it was an accident. But as time passed, more and more people noticed things that didn't add up, and the police eventually took a closer look. What they uncovered pushed the case onto the national level, grabbed the attention of millions, and, despite everything that came to light, left questions that still nag people to this day. Leslie London was born on April 26, 1951 in New York. She grew up in a large family in a quiet Long Island neighborhood. From an early age, she wanted to help people, so, after high school, she trained as a nurse and started building her career. Sometime later, she met a man named Robert Newlander, and at 33, she married him. Robert had 2 children from a previous marriage, and together, he and Leslie had a son and daughter. The family settled in a small town called Fayetteville in New York, just outside Syracuse, where Robert worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist. His career took off, and eventually he opened his own clinic. Leslie kept working as a nurse, but after their second child was born, she decided to focus on raising the kids. Over the years, she and Robert gave a lot back to their community, taking part in local charity programs, and Leslie even flew to another state to volunteer after a major hurricane. As for Robert, over his years in practice, he helped bring roughly half the town's children into the world, so the family was widely respected. By September 2012, Leslie was 61 and living a steady life. Most of her kids had moved to other cities, except for Leslie and Robert's daughter, Jenna, who was 23. On the morning of September 17th, Robert came back from his usual run, made coffee for both of them, and carried a mug into the bedroom while Leslie was in the shower, then went to wake Jenna. They were getting ready for a 9 a.m. church service, but around 8:20, when Robert returned to Leslie's room, he heard the water still running and realized she hadn't come out. He stepped into the bedroom and found his wife on the floor in a pool of blood. He immediately tried to call 911 from the phone mounted in the bathroom, but it was dead. So he shouted for Jenna and told her to call for help. Jenna called 911 from her room and told the dispatcher her mom had fallen in the shower. But, because she was on a corded landline, she couldn't go to the bathroom to see what was going on. After she gave the address, she said she was putting the phone down to check. Seconds later, the operator heard her scream that there was blood everywhere. Meanwhile, Robert pulled Leslie from the shower into the bedroom and started CPR, but nothing worked. By the time EMTs arrived, she had no pulse, and all they could do was pronounce her dead. Police interviewed Robert and Jenna about what happened and sent Leslie's body to the medical examiner's office. They learned she'd been dealing with vertigo, sudden spinning dizziness that throws off your balance, and it had been getting worse as she got older. Her relatives also said the condition ran in the family. A short time later, The pathologist ruled that she died from a fall that caused a fatal head injury, and the case was classified as an accident. So friends and family were told Leslie had slipped in the shower. But one of her closest friends, a woman named Terry, who'd once worked as a nurse in Robert's practice, started to doubt that version almost immediately. She was among the first to arrive in the house after the tragedy, and Jenna asked her to help keep the house clean because she couldn't stand the sight of her mother's blood. Jenna also asked her to make sure there were no bloodstains left in the bedroom, which struck Terry as odd. Why would there be blood in the bedroom if Leslie fell in the shower? When she stepped into the bedroom, Terry was even more surprised. There were large pools of blood on the floor and spatter on the walls and furniture, and there was so much of it that she and the housekeeper couldn't get it all out, especially from the carpet. The whole scene made her wonder if her friend had been killed, though she didn't want to believe it. She stayed with the family for the next week, turning it over in her mind, and she remembered that just days before her death, Leslie had called to say she and Robert were planning to divorce and wanted to talk in person. Only they never got the chance. Terry didn't want to start calling it a murder on nothing more than a gut feeling, so she kept quiet for about a month. Until she remembered that a few months before the incident, she, Leslie, and a few friends had met for their book club at a friend's house, and the book that night was about a man who killed his wife. After they'd all finished it, one of the women said they could ask her anything about the topic because she'd been the county's chief medical examiner. That woman, Mary, had been retired for a few years, but Terry reached out anyway. After hearing her out, Mary said the murder angle sounded unlikely. Still, she advised Terry to call the police and share her concerns, just in case. In the end, Terry did. Beyond the blood in the bedroom, she flagged something else. Robert had dragged Leslie from the shower into the bedroom. Even though an experienced doctor should know you never move someone with a head injury. Detectives listened to her with more interest than she'd expected, but there was something Terry didn't know. The local police already had doubts of their own, because an anonymous letter had landed at the DA's office claiming Robert wasn't the upstanding man everyone thought, and that Leslie had been trying to leave him. Terry's mention that Leslie had planned to divorce Robert lined up with that letter, though they still couldn't trace the sender. Even so, there wasn't much they could do yet because the medical examiner's report still listed Leslie's death as an accident. Months went by like that until Mary decided to take a closer look, pushed into action by a call from Robert, his first since Leslie's death. He didn't say anything of substance, just apologized for the silence, but it brought Terry's doubts right back to mind. She contacted the district attorney and asked to see the file. Because she'd spent more than 20 years as a medical examiner, he agreed. On one condition, she wouldn't just glance at it. She'd produce a formal report with her findings as a professional. The moment Mary started going through the documents and photos, she was stunned. Leslie had a closed head injury you might see with a fall, but that was only a sliver of the picture. There were 5 separate scalp lacerations, facial wounds, and a bruise around one eye. Mary said she'd seen that combination in only 3 situations: car crashes, falls from 20 stories up, or serious beatings, not a slip in the shower. Far more likely, in her view, Leslie had been struck 1 or more times with a heavy object. Something else also jumped out. There was clear blood spatter on the walls, the side of the bed, the nightstand, even on the water bottles sitting there. But the shower, where Leslie supposedly fell, was a good distance from the bed. In the end, Mary reached a conclusion she had no doubt about. Leslie had been murdered. She took it to the district attorney, who brought in additional medical experts, and they came to the same finding. As a result, the DA opened a formal investigation, and detectives got to work. As soon as word spread that Robert was under suspicion, his children and Leslie's relatives rallied to his side, insisting he would never hurt his wife. Robert hired one of the county's top defense attorneys, who likewise declared him innocent. The problem for investigators was simple: they didn't have a single piece of hard evidence tying him to a crime. But the deeper they dug, the more red flags they found. Police confirmed Leslie had been planning to divorce Robert. She was getting ready to move into a rental and was scheduled to sign the lease the very day she died. They also learned that shortly before her death, she'd met a man named Nevin. When detectives contacted him, he said they were just friends. He was about 30 years old and they'd been messaging for a few weeks. At some point, Robert found out about it and was furious, even though the marriage was already ending. Nevin said Robert called him and demanded he stop talking to Leslie, and he also confronted Leslie about it. Some of Leslie's friends told detectives that Robert had cheated on her more than once, and Leslie knew it. On top of that, detectives learned Robert had been in serious financial trouble for years. It started when an insurance company accused him of pushing unnecessary services at his private clinic and decided he'd been overpaid by more than $1 million. He flatly denied it, and they went to court. But the insurer stopped working with him, which meant about half of his patients had to go elsewhere because their plans no longer covered the bills. He later shut down the clinic and took a hospital job that paid far less. And shortly before Leslie died, he lost that job too. Colleagues told police he had changed over the past few years. He'd become short-tempered and kept clashing with people, and some staff eventually refused to work with him. With all that in hand, detectives decided to look in the house one more time. It was April by then, 7 months after Leslie's death. Robert had already sold the place, but the new owners hadn't moved in yet, and they allowed a walkthrough without a warrant. To the forensic team's surprise, there were still visible blood traces in the bathroom and the bedroom. They also spotted dried spatter on the curtains beside the bed and on the headboard. Detectives said they hadn't seen any blood on the headboard the day Leslie died because pillows were propped there, and now they couldn't explain how her blood ended up on that spot. By Robert and Jenna's account, he first pulled Leslie out of the shower into the bedroom, then dragged her again and positioned her between the bed and the window, explaining that the bathroom was too dark and too cramped for him to start CPR. On the 911 call, you can hear Jenna yelling at her dad to stop moving Leslie, because even she knew that with a head or neck injury, you keep a person still. But even acknowledging the fact that he dragged her toward the bed, the blood on the headboard made no sense. It suggested that at some point, Leslie was actually on the bed, yet there wasn't a single drop on the sheets. Detectives brought Robert back in for questioning, and he showed up with his attorneys, insisting that everything had happened exactly as he'd said, and that he'd never hurt his wife. As for the blood spatter in the bedroom, Robert's attorneys had explanations. First, they said, when Robert stepped into the shower and found Leslie on the floor, he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. After he dragged her into the bedroom, the sleeves got bloody and he pulled the shirt off so it wouldn't get in the way while he tried to help her, which, they argued, could account for some of the splatter. Second, they said the EMTs could have caused it. They worked on Leslie for several minutes, so their gloves would have been covered in blood, and if they peeled them off carelessly, droplets could have flicked around the room. But detectives weren't convinced by those explanations. For starters, there was blood splatter all over the bedroom, yet none on the bed. It looked like someone had changed the sheets, and if Robert's story were true, pulling that off without Jenna, the paramedics, or the police noticing would have been almost impossible. Robert denied changing anything, but the housekeeper told officers the sheets on the bed the day Leslie died weren't the ones she'd put on the day before. The prosecutor laid out a version that tied the loose ends together. He argued Robert killed his wife hours before the supposed fall in the shower, that he attacked her in the bedroom, possibly on the bed, and struck her in the head multiple times. After that, either Leslie tried to get away and ran to the shower, or Robert dragged her there and slammed her head against the stone ledge to stage an accident. Then, the theory goes, he turned on the water and left her under the shower for hours. He went for a run, but in reality drove to a nearby lake to dump the weapon, and possibly the bedding and his bloody clothes. When he got back, he woke Jenna so that minutes later she'd call 911 and be a witness to her mother being found in the shower. After that, Robert went into the bathroom, lifted Leslie and dragged her into the bedroom to give himself a reason for the blood on the floor and walls, which would also explain why a doctor with more than 30 years of experience made the basic mistake of moving someone with a head injury. He likely meant to call Jenna only after that, so she'd first see her mother in the shower. But he didn't account for one thing. Jenna saw the blood in the bedroom before he ever pulled Leslie from the bathroom. As we know from the 911 call, she yelled, "There's blood everywhere." And at that point, she still hadn't seen her mother, which means the blood was already in the bedroom while Leslie was still in the shower. Something that doesn't fit the fall story at all. Over the next few months, detectives kept looking for more evidence, but came up empty. There was one key development, though. They brought in a bloodstain pattern analyst who said the spatter in Leslie's bedroom pointed to blows to the head, not some other scenario like falling in the shower. About a year later, in June 2014, prosecutors finally charged Robert with second-degree murder. He was arrested and released on $100,000 bail. The trial began almost a year after that. Robert and Leslie's children stood by him, as did some of her relatives. His defense stuck to the same story, a fall in the shower, and said he dragged her into the bedroom only because it was too cramped and dark to start life-saving measures in there. They also called their own expert, who testified that the available information just wasn't enough to prove a homicide. A personal trainer and Leslie's relatives told the jury she had vertigo and that it had gotten worse in recent months. The prosecution leaned on the medical findings that undercut the fall theory and pointed instead to blows from a heavy object. They noted that every injury was centered on the head. With a slip in the shower, you'd expect an elbow, a knee, or something else to be banged up too. And then there were the bruises on her face, on the opposite side from the spot she supposedly hit, raising the obvious question of where those came from. Jenna took the stand, and her testimony split the room. First, she contradicted the housekeeper and said the bedding was the same set as the day before. When the prosecutor asked if she'd seen blood in the bedroom before Robert pulled Leslie from the shower, she said no, even though her initial statements and the 911 call suggested otherwise. She also said she tried to help her father with CPR, something she hadn't mentioned before. And when you add that to the other steps she claimed she'd taken during the brief gap in the 911 call, it should have taken at least 50 seconds. Yet, she was off the line for only 13. Police tried to recreate everything she described and couldn't do it in less than 50 seconds. On top of that, Jenna testified she saw her father pull off a bloody shirt and toss it aside. But by the time police and EMTs arrived, that shirt was gone, and in the months that followed, Robert never produced it. Prosecutors said Jenna was so unwilling to accept that her father might be guilty that she talked herself into seeing the facts as proof he wasn't. Even so, the jury found Robert guilty, and in July 2015, he was sentenced to 20 years to life. Leslie's sister said she still didn't believe Robert did it and was disappointed by the verdict. Robert's children immediately hired a new attorney, known for defending mob boss John Gotti, and he began filing appeals. He soon discovered that one juror had flagrantly violated the rules by discussing the case with relatives and friends. Her own father even texted, "Make sure he's guilty." In all, about 7,000 messages were uncovered, and the defense moved for a new trial. The judge denied it at first, but 3 years later, in 2018, Robert's team got the conviction thrown out. A new trial was set, and for the next 2 years he remained free on $1 million bail. The new trial opened in the spring of 2022, and Robert's attorneys were aiming for an acquittal. What they didn't know was that the prosecution had 2 new pieces of evidence that leaned hard toward homicide. First, they sent the bed's headboard to a lab. 10 years after the killing, technicians found a tiny fragment of fatty tissue from the victim's scalp embedded in it. If Leslie had really slipped in the shower, there's no plausible way that material ends up on the headboard. But if she was struck in the head while on the bed, it makes perfect sense. The second clue had been hiding in plain sight all this time. Robert's story went like this. He woke up, went for a run by the lake, came home, made coffee for himself and Leslie, set her mug on the nightstand, and about half an hour later found her in the shower. But when the team re-examined scene photos, something jumped out. There wasn't a single drop of blood on the coffee mug, while the nightstand and the water bottles beside it were dotted with splatter. Given the direction of the droplets, the mug should have been hit along with everything else. The only way it stays clean is if the mug wasn't there when the blood hit those surfaces. In other words, it supports the prosecution's timeline. Robert killed Leslie before he ever left the house, then later brought in the coffee when there was already blood on several bedroom surfaces and her body was in the shower. He then staged it so Jenna would see him discover his wife as if she'd fallen. Then there was one more change from the first trial: motive. Back then, prosecutors didn't have a solid theory they could back up. This time, they argued Robert had learned Leslie was getting ready to move into a rental, and he knew she'd been talking with another man. jealousy and control could have driven a violent outburst. Or, the motive was mostly financial. Robert had lost his clinic, left his job, and gone from a well-off physician to unemployed. Under New York's equitable distribution law, a divorce could give Leslie roughly half of the home's value and other marital assets. He'd likely have to sell the house and hand over a large share of the proceeds, a hit he might not have been willing to take. Thanks to those new pieces of evidence, the jury needed only a few hours to find Robert guilty, and on May 2, 2022, he received the same sentence as before: 20 years to life. Robert's children and other relatives still didn't believe he was responsible and asked the judge for leniency. Robert himself used his final statement to plead for the chance to die close to his family, rather than behind bars. But the sentence stood. His lawyers tried to overturn the verdict, yet in 2024, the appeal was denied, leaving him with virtually no path to undo the conviction or seek early release. So this high-profile, tangled case finally came to a close. Though even with 2 convictions, some people still believe Robert is innocent. Beyond his children and several of Leslie's relatives, there are plenty who followed the case and think an accident could have actually happened. And one last note, remember the anonymous letter police received days after Leslie's death? The one that cast doubt on Robert's character and first pushed investigators to question the accident narrative? Detectives tried again and again to find the author, but the sender's identity remains a mystery to this day. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.